James asked with an odd smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Don't you want to try the coffee I made especially for you, honey?" I sat at my sister-in-law Nina's elegant dining table in her Nashville home, where we gather for our monthly family brunch. The coffee cup in front of me had a strange, almost metallic smell that made my stomach turn. My name is Christina, and at 29, I never imagined I'd be questioning whether my own husband was trying to poison me. But after 3 years of marriage and countless incidents of accidental food poisoning, I had learned to be cautious, especially around Nina. She had a way of orchestrating situations that left me sick or humiliated, always with that same innocent smile James was wearing now. "How thoughtful of you," I replied, forcing a smile while my mind raced. The aroma wafting from the cup was unlike any coffee I had smelled before. It reminded me of the tea I drank last month at Nina's house, the tea that landed me in urgent care. The doctors couldn't explain my symptoms, and Nina had insisted she'd made the tea exactly the same way she made her own. Now, she watched me intently from across the table, absently stirring her own untouched coffee. "James has become quite the barista lately," she said with a smirk. "He's been practicing different brewing methods just for you." The way she emphasized for you sent chills down my spine. I had noticed James spending more time at Nina's house lately, claiming they were planning a surprise for our upcoming anniversary. But something felt off. The whispered conversations had stopped when I entered the room, the strange texts I glimpsed on his phone, and now this coffee with its peculiar scent. I lifted the cup, pretending to take a sip while studying their expressions. James and Nina exchanged a quick glance that confirmed my suspicions. Making a show of checking my phone, I abruptly stood up. "Oh, would you look at that? I need to make a quick call for work. Nina, would you mind if I use your study?" As I walked past her place setting, I deliberately stumbled, quickly switching our coffee cups in confusion of steadying myself. "I'm so sorry," I exclaimed, straightening up. "I'm such a klutz sometimes." Nina waved off my apology with a tight smile. "Just try not to break anything in the study." I nodded and hurried away, my heart pounding. Through the study doorway, I could still see them at the table. Now I just had to wait and watch. Nina lifted the coffee cup to her lips, and my stomach clenched with anxiety. Part of me wanted to stop her, to warn her, but I needed to know the truth. I had spent too many nights in emergency rooms, too many hours doubled over in pain, always after sharing meals with them. It wasn't always like this. When I first met James at a friend's wedding in Nashville 3 years ago, he was charming and attentive. Nina had seemed welcoming, too, inviting me to family gatherings and offering to help plan our wedding. But looking back, I should have noticed the red flags. The way she would accidentally spill things on my dress at important events, or how my food always seemed to have extra seasoning when she helped cook. The incident started small. An upset stomach here, a mild allergic reaction there. James always had an excuse ready. Maybe it was something you ate earlier, or you must be coming down with something. But the pattern was becoming clear. The worst was 2 months ago when I ended up hospitalized after eating breakfast at their house. The doctors found traces of something in my system they couldn't identify, but James convinced everyone I must have taken some expired medication. Now, I gripped the doorframe, watching as Nina took another sip of the coffee. James was typing on his phone, seemingly unconcerned. My own untouched cup sat cold on the table where I'd left it, the metallic smell still lingering in my nose, making me shudder. A slight tremor in Nina's hand caught my attention. She set down the cup, her face suddenly pale. "James," she said, her voice shaking. "Something's wrong." James looked up, his expression shifting from confusion to horror as he realized which cup she was drinking from. He jumped up, knocking over his chair. "Nina, what's happening?" Her hands trembled violently now. I feel..." She tried to stand but stumbled, grabbing the edge of the table for support. "James, what did you put in that coffee?" I stepped out of the study, my phone already recording. James was beside Nina now, his face ashen. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup," he whispered. In the silence of the dining room, his words carried clearly. Nina's eyes widened with realization and fear. "Call an ambulance," she gasped, sliding to the floor. "Please, I can't." I dialed 911 immediately, my hand steady despite the chaos unfolding before me. "Nina's on the floor now," I said to the dispatcher. "She's having a severe reaction to something in her coffee. She's conscious but experiencing tremors." As I spoke, Nina's eyes locked onto mine. The usual cold calculation in her gaze was replaced by raw fear. "Christina," she gasped. "You switched, you knew." "Ma'am, the ambulance is on its way," the dispatcher assured me. "Please stay on the line." James was growing more frantic by the second. "Nina, what's happening? That wasn't supposed to. It wasn't meant." "Shut up, James." Nina snapped through gritted teeth, her anger momentarily overcoming her distress. "This is all your fault. You said it would just make her sick enough to miss the board meeting next week. You promised it wouldn't be traced." My blood ran cold. The board meeting, where I was scheduled to present my proposal for a major client account. The same account Nina had been trying to land for months at our competing firms. Everything started clicking into place. "The tea last month," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "and the breakfast incident 2 months ago. Those weren't accidents, were they?" Nina's face contorted with another wave of pain. "The tea was supposed to keep you home during the Johnson contract presentation, but you went anyway," she choked out, clutching her stomach and doubling over. "James said we just needed to discredit you, make clients think you were unreliable." The wail of sirens filled the air outside. James stood up, backing away from both of us. "Nina, stop talking. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," she spat, her words slurring slightly. "We've been planning this for months. Ever since Christina started outperforming me at every client meeting. You were supposed to make sure she drank it today." The paramedics burst through the front door. I quickly stepped aside to let them work. As they loaded Nina onto a stretcher, I stopped recording and sent the video to my private email, then to my lawyer. James stood frozen, watching as his carefully constructed plan unraveled before him. "I'll ride with her to the hospital," I told the paramedics, my voice firm. "After all, I need to make sure my sister-in-law gets the proper treatment." I met James's terrified gaze. "And I'm sure the doctors will be very interested in knowing exactly what was in that coffee." The emergency room at Nashville General Hospital was a flurry of activity as doctors rushed to treat Nina. I sat in the waiting room, my phone clutched in my hand, replaying the recording of her confession, the tremors in her voice, the panic in her eyes. It was all the evidence I needed. "Family of Nina Anderson?" A nurse called out. I stood, noting James's conspicuous absence. He'd mumbled something about parking the car 20 minutes ago and hadn't returned. "I'm her sister-in-law," I said, following the nurse through the double doors. "How is she?" "She's stabilized, but we found concerning levels of toxins in her system." The nurse's expression was grave. "The doctor would like to speak with you about some unusual findings in her blood work." Dr. Phillips, a tall woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, was waiting outside Nina's room. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, "can you tell me exactly what happened before your sister-in-law became ill?" I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. "I think you should listen to this first." I played the recording from brunch, watching as the doctor's professional concern morphed into alarm. "This is very serious," she said, making notes on her tablet. "The substance we found isn't something that accidentally ends up in coffee. We're looking at deliberate contamination." Just then, James appeared at the end of the hallway, his face pale and sweaty. He'd clearly overheard the doctor's words. "Christina," he started, taking a step toward me. "Let me explain." "Stay back," Dr. Phillips warned, pressing the nurse's call button. "Security to room 412, please." James raised his hands in surrender. "This is all a misunderstanding." Nina was confused. She didn't know what she was saying. "Really?" I pulled up the texts I discovered on his phone last week, the ones I'd secretly forwarded to myself. "So these messages between you and Nina about making sure I was out of commission before the Henderson presentation were just friendly conversation?" His face drained of color. "You went to my phone? After I found the strange powder in your desk drawer?" "Yes, I did." I turned to Dr. Phillips. Doctor, I've been hospitalized 3 times in the past 6 months with unexplained symptoms. I'd like to know if they match what you found in Nina's system today. Dr. Phillips's eyes narrowed. We'll need to run some tests to compare. Security will make sure your husband remains available for questioning. 2 security guards appeared, positioning themselves on either side of James. His carefully constructed facade crumbled. Nina and I, he stammered. We were just trying to help you slow down. You were working too hard, taking all the big clients. Nina said if we could just make you take some time off. By poisoning me? My voice was steady, even as my hands shook with rage. How long have you been doing this? Was it you tamper with my food at the Christmas party too? James's silence was all the answer I needed. Through the window of Nina's room, I could see her lying connected to various monitors. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced by the fear of someone who knew their schemes had finally caught up with them. Detective Mendoza is on her way, Dr. Phillips said quietly. She'll want to take statements from everyone involved. I nodded, feeling an odd sense of calm. The truth was finally coming out, and there was no going back. Detective Mendoza arrived within the hour, her presence commanding attention in the sterile hospital corridor. A seasoned investigator specializing in domestic crimes, she listened intently as I played the recording from brunch and showed her the text messages. Mrs. Bennett, she said, reviewing her notes, you mentioned previous hospitalizations. Can you tell me more about those incidents? I pulled out my phone again, opening a document I've been quietly maintaining for months. The first time was in February, after a dinner at Nina's house. I had severe stomach pains and dizziness. The second was in April, the tea incident, and then in June, after breakfast with them. My voice remained steady as I continued. Each time, the symptoms were similar but just different enough that the doctors couldn't pinpoint a cause. The detective's eyes narrowed as she studied my detailed log of dates, symptoms, and circumstances. And you've been keeping records ever since you noticed the pattern? I hesitated, then pulled out another phone from my purse. I also started carrying a backup phone with a different number. I used it to record conversations when I was around them. I have several where Nina and James discussed their plans, though they were careful not to be explicit. I pressed play. Nina's voice came through clearly. The Henderson account is worth millions, James. We can't let her ruin everything we've worked for. Just stick to the plan. A few days of illness should be enough. James's response was just as damning. I've got something stronger this time. She won't make it to the presentation. Detective Mendoza's expression hardened. Through the window of Nina's room, I could see my sister-in-law was now awake, looking significantly less confident than she had at brunch. The hospital is running toxicology screens, the detective informed me. Dr. Phillips has already identified several substances that don't occur naturally. We'll need samples from your home as well. A commotion down the hall caught our attention. James was arguing with the security guards, his voice rising in desperation. I exhaled, gripping my phone tighter. It was over, and this time I had all the proof I needed. I need to speak with my wife. James shouted. Detective Mendoza stepped between us. Mr. Bennett, you're not helping your case. We've already found evidence of premeditation. James let out a hollow laugh that echoed through the corridor. Premeditated? We were just trying to slow her down. She was working herself to death, taking all the major accounts. Na said if we could just make her take some time off. By poisoning her? Mendoza's voice was sharp. James paled. No, that's not. We never meant to. Then what exactly did you mean to do? I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. When you put something in my coffee this morning, what was supposed to happen? His silence spoke volumes. Behind him, I saw Na watching through the hospital room window, her face frozen in a mask of fear and calculation. Was she already trying to spin the story, to explain away months of systematic poisoning as some twisted attempt to help me? We'll need both their phones. Mendoza instructed the security guards, and I want officers posted at both doors. Nobody leaves until we get the toxicology results. Dr. Phillips entered Na's room, a tablet in hand, her expression grim. Mendoza and I followed while James remained outside with the guards. Na tried to sit up, but the tremors hadn't fully subsided. The toxicology report shows elevated levels of several substances, Dr. Phillips announced. Her tone clinical. Most concerning is a compound typically used in pharmaceutical testing, something the general public shouldn't have access to. That's impossible. Na blurted. James looked stricken. It was just something to cause mild symptoms. Mild symptoms? Mendoza interrupted, flipping open her notebook. Like the ones your sister-in-law has been experiencing for the past 6 months? The door opened, and another detective entered, holding an evidence bag. We found these in Mr. Bennett's office at Anderson Marketing. He presented several small bottles with clinical labels and pages of notes detailing dosages and reactions. My knees weakened. You were documenting everything, like some kind of experiment. It wasn't like that. Na protested, but her voice wavered. You tracked what worked. I said, the realization hitting me like a punch. The first few attempts weren't effective enough, so you increased the dosages. Mendoza examined the bottles. Did you know these substances could be lethal in higher concentrations? Silence. Through the window, I saw James sink into a chair, head in his hands. The Henderson account. I said slowly, pieces clicking into place. This wasn't just about a presentation, was it? The client specifically requested me as their lead. You needed me out of the way, permanently. Na's face twisted in anger and fear. You were ruining everything. I built that client portfolio for years. Then you show up, and suddenly everyone wants to work with you instead. James said he could fix it. I murmured. By killing me. We weren't trying to. Na started, but Dr. Phillips cut her off. The concentration in today's coffee was significantly higher than previous samples, the doctor said, looking directly at Na. If she had consumed it, the outcome would have been severe, possibly fatal. Mendoza turned to the officers. We'll need full warrants for their homes and offices. And contact the pharmaceutical company on these bottles. Find out how they got them. Na slumped back against her pillows, the fight draining from her face. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she whispered. James kept saying we just needed one more try. I stepped closer to her bed, my hands trembling. Every time I got sick, every meeting I missed, every client I lost. You were both there, watching, taking notes on how your poison was affecting me. What kind of people does that make you? Outside, I heard officers reading James's rights. Na stared at her hands, unable to meet my gaze. Detective, I said, turning away from my sister-in-law, I'm ready to make my formal statement. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but felt like years. Each day, I sat in the courtroom as the prosecution methodically laid out their case. The evidence was overwhelming. Bottles from James's office, detailed poisoning notes, recorded messages discussing their plans. Na, usually so poised, looked small in her defendant's chair. James never met my eyes, staring at the floor while expert witnesses detailed the lethal effects of the substances they had used. Dr. Phillips's testimony was damning. She showed how the dosages had been increased over time, proving clear intent to cause harm. A pharmaceutical company representative confirmed that James had stolen the compounds through a college friend who worked in their research department. The defendants engaged in a calculated pattern of behavior. The prosecutor argued in her closing statement. This was not mere corporate sabotage. It was a systematic attempt to harm Mrs. Bennett, escalating to a level that could have resulted in her death. When the verdict was read, I felt no joy, only relief. James and Na were found guilty on multiple counts, including attempted murder and conspiracy. The premeditated nature of these actions, the judge stated, carried out against a family member over an extended period, demands the maximum sentence. I watched them being led away in handcuffs, thinking about how greed and jealousy had twisted 2 people I once trusted. They had lost everything, their business, their reputations, their freedom, all in an attempt to destroy me. A year later, I stood at the podium of the Nashville Business Leaders Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote speech. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the kind of opportunity Na had tried to keep me from achieving. The Henderson account, which they had been so desperate to steal, had led to even bigger clients, establishing me as one of the top marketing executives in the region. Success isn't just about talent or hard work. I began looking out at the audience. It's about integrity, about building genuine relationships based on trust. I paused, letting the words settle. Sometimes, the biggest threats to our success come from those closest to us. But surviving those challenges makes us stronger. After my speech, several young professionals approached me, eager for advice. One woman, her eyes bright with determination, asked how I had stayed composed through it all. I focused on what I could control. I told her. I gathered evidence, trusted my instincts, and refused to let fear stop me from pursuing my goals. That evening, an email from the Henderson client confirmed they were renewing their contract for another 3 years. I smiled, thinking about how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't trusted my instincts that day at brunch. The local paper had run a small article that morning about Na and James beginning their prison sentences. I didn't read it. Instead, I focused on my next project, knowing that the best revenge wasn't getting even. It was moving forward and succeeding despite those who tried to hold me back.